Hi, boys and girls. This is Grandma Sheilla, and our story tonight is called The Boy and His Spare Moments. Well, a tall, gangly boy stood at the door of a mansion. That mansion was owned by the principal of a very prominent school. The boy stood on that front porch looking at the big tall pillars, and he knocked on the door. And the servant came to the door, and she looked him up and down. He was dressed in his best, but it was not what she was used to. She said, "What can I do for you?" And he said, "I'd really like to see Mr. Brown, please. I really have to see him." She looked him again, and she thought, well, with those clothes, he must be a beggar. And she turned to him and she pointed and she said, "People like you go to the kitchen door. Go around the house now." And she shut the door. Well, he wasn't going to be detoured by the servant. So he went around the house and he knocked on the back door. Well, she came to the kitchen door and she looked at him. And once again he said, "May I please see Mr. Brown? I really need to see him." Now she was really looking at him and she said, "I bet all you want is a meal. You want some breakfast, don't you? Are you hungry?" Well, what could he do but answer? He was hungry. He said, "Yes, ma'am." And she said, "All right, I'll make you some breakfast and then you can be out of here." So she did. She cooked him some eggs and made him some toast, and she put it with a big tall glass of milk in front of him where she told him to sit. Well, he politely thanked her, and then he started to eat that food, remembering the manners that he had been taught. Well, when he got all done, he carefully picked up the dishes and set them by the sink. And then he looked at her. He kind of reached up and felt his hair to make sure he still looked okay. And he said, "I really do need to see Mr. Brown." And she looked at him and she said, "I bet you want clothes, but I don't have any right now." And he said, "Please, miss, I really need to see Mr. Brown." Well, finally, she got kind of disgusted with him. And she said, "All right, if you must, you must. He's in the library. But you know, he's a busy man and he needs time to himself." Well, she said, "Come on, follow me." So he walked through that beautiful big house. He looked at everything as he went. He'd never been in such a fancy place before, but he just had to see Mr. Brown. Well, the girl knocked on the library door, and there was an answer, "Come in." And she went in, and before that young man could say anything, she said, "I'm sorry, but this guy won't leave. He says he just absolutely has to see you." Well, Mr. Brown wasn't real interested. He gazed up a little bit, looked at the young man, and then kind of continued the stuff he was doing. And the young man, he said, "Excuse me, sir." Well, The story doesn't tell exactly what he said. But after listening to that, Mr. Brown looked at him and he said, "Sit down." And he started pulling books off of his library shelves. He got out things like history and Greek and mathematics and all sorts of things. And he said, "Sit down. I'll give you an examination to see what you know." Well, he started asking him big, long questions. What did this Greek word mean? What happened during this period of history? He went on and on and on for a long period of time. But every question that young man answered. Finally, Mr. Brown was actually very intently looking at him, and finally he put his book down and he said, "Where did you learn all of this?" Because it was obvious that he hadn't had much schooling, and he spent most of his time working, trying to earn some money. And the young man said, "In my spare moments, sir." And Mr. Brown said, "You must have used your spare moments really wisely in order to be this far. You're almost ready for college." Well, he was very interested in that young man that used his spare moments to learn things. Well, you know, boys and girls, an awful lot of the people in our world don't use their spare moments. Or if they use them to do mischief and to get into trouble. And where do they end up? They end up spending their spare moments in jail. Well, the devil, he likes to push you into temptation during those spare moments that you're not doing anything instead of using them for good. And do you know what he does? He tempts you. In those days, he would tempt the little boys that instead of studying were running around on the streets. He would tempt them to sit down and gamble for marbles. And then when they got bigger, he tempted them to go into the local tavern to have a drink. And they would have more and more till they didn't have money to pay for it. And oh, they had horrible headaches. And they would do that so much that they couldn't do their jobs. Well, the devil knows that if he can get in to those little spare moments, that he can fill you full of mischief. Boys and girls, if you use your spare moments wisely, like this young man in the story did, you can end up being something great, something you really want to do in life. But if you waste those moments, those things won't happen for you. And you know, that's what Jesus wants us to do, is to spend our spare moments learning about Him, learning education, helping somebody else. There's tons of things that you can do in a spare moment. And the boy in our story ended up getting to go to that fancy higher education school because when he was young, he had filled his spare moments with knowledge. Thank you, boys and girls, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye now.